Bank of Canada says, brace for impact. Ford and LeBlanc head to the U.S. to talk tariffs. NDP and Greens in BC ink a deal. Liberal regulations to cost thousands of jobs in Alberta. And weed dealers to get government relief. All that and more on the Really Big Show. We got lots going on today. We got a lot and a lot and a lot. We want to say thank you to one of our listeners. We're getting people sending in when they're watching. And the demographics are all, you got that image there to throw up there, Rommel? There you go. We got all kinds of demographics that listen to us. So we really appreciate everybody that kind of listens in. And we appreciate feedback and comments. And we actually are running live across a multitude of channels, including YouTube, X, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram. So you can communicate on those things. When we monitor the comments on YouTube there. So if you want to comment, you can do it on YouTube and you can be part of the show. Welcome, Ian. How are things in Ottawa? We got some snow here in Kelowna today.
It's just another sort of grey day here. It's minus sort of single digits, but not as exciting as Kelowna is right now.
Yeah, we'll talk about our weather here in a bit, but yeah, so it is kind of a matching day here, awfully gray here in Kelowna. We're going to add a little fun and flair into our show here. So days the government prorogued now, 66 days. 66 days that Parliament hasn't sat. No, not yet with that. 66 days. You can just put up the Really Big Show graphic. And then it was 934 days since German Chancellor Olaf Scholz asked Trudeau directly for LNG, and 791 days since Japanese Prime Minister asked us for LNG. And then 757 days since the South Koreans asked us for LNG, and all those things. Justin Trudeau said there is no business case for LNG, despite clear international demand. So there you go.
Yeah, not going to go down as his best decision. I don't expect. I mean, the demand is from Japan. There was recently they came out and said that they expect quite a considerable increase in demand out of Japan. And I believe Japan's the second largest importer of LNG, just after China. And I just heard on the CBC this morning, actually, there was a chap from Japan who was like, yet again, they're still trying, because Mitsubishi has part ownership of BC LNG, I believe. And he was once again begging. He was saying, we like British Columbia specifically is our preferred partner, because it might not seem that obvious, but if you actually look on a map of the Pacific, it's the closest supplier that Japan could expect to have, even closer than Australia. So,
Yeah.
they still want it, and some LNG shipments are expected to go out, I think, in the middle of this year, but it's nowhere near the sort of amount that the Japanese would like and that they could consume. And obviously that's just one customer. There's also South Korea, which is just, hop, skip, and a jump over the Sea of Japan there. And then that's Korea also being served. The Chinese maybe would also sign up. And then, I mean, Germany and the Europeans, they're a bit harder to reach, because then you have to go on the other side of Canada. But they're always desperate for fuel, aren't they? They're desperate for a lot of things right now.
In all three cases, the Trudeau Liberals have declined to expand LNG exports, prioritizing Canada's climate strategy instead, and questioning the economical rationale for new LNG infrastructure. And that's what's put us in this predicament that we're in right now. And then with that said, the Bank of Canada, Tiff Macklin, says, brace for impact. And he said that the hard data so far looks good, but you can't see much damage from the trade war yet in the hard data yet. But when you look at the survey data, it's pretty clear consumer confidence, business confidence has been sharply affected, and we're expecting to see pullback in household spending and business investment. This is going to have a big impact on the economy. Canadians are worried about their job security and financial health as a result of these trade tensions. Businesses have lowered sales outlooks, notably in manufacturing sectors that depend on discretionary spending households. Credit has become more difficult to access for some businesses. And with a weaker Canadian dollar, the cost of imported machinery and equipment has risen. And he said there is weakness ahead. The economic impact could be severe, and the uncertainty alone is already causing harm. Monetary policy cannot offset the impacts of a trade war. Tariffs are going to weaken this Canadian economy. There's going to be weaker U.S. demand and exports. Yeah, so certainly what we're hearing from businesses is that having an impact on their investment plans, they're scaling back hiring attention. That is going to spill over to the domestic economy, and it could well mean layoffs. And he said the bank will proceed carefully. And they dropped the rate there yesterday. And the next rate is April 16th. And if Carney is going to be the PM starting tomorrow. And then he's been famous for dropping rates. So, I mean, that might be good for a lot of people that are trying to renew their mortgage, but it may not be good for the Canadian dollar, that's the balancing act that the Bank of Canada is going to have to do, because they're probably going to have to lower rates to stoke investment, but at the same time, they may be stoking inflation, especially with trade wars there.
Also going to be mightily exposed to the US dollar, which is that they're not really lowering rates, nowhere near as fast as we are anyway. So the mighty dollar is going to bully the Canadian dollar to death, pretty much. And it's also in terms of debt, if we want to use any debt, you hear Mark Carney and a lot of the Liberals, they're always bragging about how Canada has a certain amount of fiscal headroom and it has a really low debt to GDP. Oh, it's not really low, it's actually really high, but a relatively low debt to GDP ratio. What that means is when they say that is, oh, we can borrow money, for emergency spending or for investment or whatever. But if the return on investment is as low as that, like 2.75% now and going lower, then why would you want to invest in Canadian debt? Especially when you could just invest in US debt and get a much better rate. So there's also that to consider. I mean, it's a double-edged sword, really, bringing the rates down.
The only thing that we have, like our biggest asset, and again, I'll refer to that article that I wrote, it's on LinkedIn, and not letting our superstars out the gate, it's energy. Energy is our key. Energy is our key. And if we don't have a government that is conducive to the energy asset that we have, we're going to end up in the same spot or even worse than we are right now, especially with the tariffs looming, right? So if we don't figure out a way to prioritize energy exports, it's going to be a rough road for Canada.
Yeah, well, I mean, just have a look at countries. These lists are easily obtained all over the place. I think the World Bank does it, CIA, Factbook does it. But just look at like countries by oil reserves. Canada's about fourth, I think. It's up there with countries that have literally nothing else but oil. Countries like Iraq and Iran. These countries rely on oil as like basically their sole source of income. And we have a similar sort of amount, if not more, actually, I think, than both of those countries.
Yeah.
So that's just one thing. That's just one commodity. Then there are things like LNG. I mean, Canada doesn't actually have very much LNG in terms of reserves, like known reserves, but it's expected that there is a lot more. It's just not really been looked for. But still, that's another massive money maker. And then you look at minerals and things like that. Canada is in the sort of like top 5, top 10 for loads of commodities. And there are countries out there, we have to emphasize this. There are countries out there who have quite literally nothing else. They don't really have a services economy. They don't have finance economy. They don't have anything. Whereas Canada has all that stuff, plus, as much oil as Iraq. I mean, it's kind of on the face of it, it's just absurd that we wouldn't try and dine out on that to the max.
The really big show is going to go out on a limb here. I don't know, not much of a limb, because based on diversity of resources in Canada, we are the richest resource nation in the world, and we've had a government for the last 10 years that has suppressed these natural resources in prioritizing what Justin Trudeau says in his own words. They prioritized climate change instead and made and sacrificed the Canadian economy for that climate change, which the biggest economies in the world do not do. China does not do it, neither does the Americans.
Yeah, I would say, just in the interest of being, extremely fair and accurate, I might say, I would say Russia probably has better all-round energy, because all-round commodities. I mean, you look at what they have. It's actually
Yeah. Well, they're the
It
mirror.
probably makes sense. It is the biggest country in the world,
Yeah,
but
they're the
it just
they're
has absolutely crazy amounts of everything, really, in
yeah
Russia.
they're the mirror of Canada, except they're in the communist world and we're in the free world, and that's I guess where I'm making my claim is because Canada's the second largest landmass in the world. The Russians are the first, and then basically those two economies are very much mirrored, and the geology and the topography and everything.
Yeah, I would say they're not communist anymore, but they are kind of owned by communists because they're so dependent on China, I guess you could say.
Doug Ford and LeBlanc headed to the United States to talk to President Trump on reopening that 2019 trade pact, and so that's they're going in. And Dominique LeBlanc says Canada is ready to negotiate. Obviously, they should do it with respect. Yeah, so they're looking at a review. It's not a renegotiation; it's a review. So yeah, so they're also saying the conversation will be about lowering the temperature and focusing on the process the president set up. The Canadian delegation to meet with U.S. Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick. He also imposed an illegal 25% tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum. So that'd be one thing to do is dial back the rhetoric, especially dialing it back through the media, all these bold claims and stuff like that. It's not doing the Canadian economy any good to drive all this fear into the market. I guess it's done really well for the Liberals, though, because it's actually surged them in the polls. The more fear they can drive into the Canadians, the better for them. But I think that they need to figure out a way to do this without, like, I mean, the Mexicans are doing it, and they're not amping up the fear. The Australians and all that stuff. And why is it so much rhetoric in with Jagmeet Singh, banning Trump from coming to Canada, all these things. And we need to dial back the rhetoric and figure out a solution for the betterment of Canada.
Well, unfortunately, Donald Trump has chosen Canada to receive his worst attacks, hasn't he? I mean, he's barely said anything about Mexico in the grand scheme of things. He
Right.
said far, far worse things about Canada than he has about Russia or China or Iran or Hamas or any villain that you might want to point to. Trump has said worse about Canada. So we have to we always have to remember the context. Trump is gunning for Canada. I mean, what are you supposed to do if you're the leader of Canada or one of the leaders of Canada, like a minister or something? What really are you supposed to do when there's a foreigner attacking your country and your people are saying, "What the hell? Please help us, like protect us." You kind of have to do something, don't you? I mean, I can see why they've hit back. And actually, I would go a bit further and sort of say they've been remarkably tame, actually, and passive. The leader of the world's most powerful country, a foreigner, has said numerous times that he wants to cripple the Canadian economy and steal Canada, basically, annex Canada. That is like, just for a second, imagine if he was doing that about like just Italy or Korea, or just think of any other country. How would they react to that? They would basically consider that a declaration of war, I think. And yet Canada has been remarkably well behaved, and everybody, even the most kind of despised politicians in Canada, people like Justin Trudeau, been astonishingly passive and meek in the face of that. So I don't know. I mean, what are you supposed to do when a foreigner says that he wants to steal your country and end your sovereignty? It's like the most extraordinary insult imaginable, isn't it, in international affairs?
Yeah, more Trump in the news, though. He threatens now 200% tariff on European alcohol. You know a lot about European alcohol, being from the UK there. So he says that he will apply a tariff on, a bunch of the the European alcohol.
Yeah, I mean, God bless the Americans. They already have to suffer with their garbage beer, but now they're not even going to be able to free themselves by having a real glass of wine from Italy or France.
Are they
It's an absolute
champagnes
tragedy. I feel so sorry for them.
or champagne? There you go.
Yeah, champagne. I mean, obviously California knocks out some good wines. You'd have to be a real Grinch to deny that. Some of them are quite nice, but they don't stand up to French wines or Italian wines, I would say, and maybe even arguably not even Spanish wines. So, I mean, it's sad. And the aficionados in America are gonna be unhappy about that if that actually occurs, if that goes through. But they'll also be unhappy, I think, the average American, because they'll have to pay more money. I would presume that it would cost more to buy domestic. So, because the biggest wine producer in the world is Italy, and then I believe number two is France. So I mean,
Yeah.
like in the top five wine producers, Italy, Spain, and France are all there. It's like they churn that stuff out like mad, and it's very high quality, sort of
I
relatively
mean,
speaking. So it means that they're going to have crapper wine, and it'll probably cost more money.
I mean, for me, I'd rather they focus on other countries than keep continually focusing on Canada and all this rhetoric that goes out on Canada. You know,
Yeah, the stupidity of the Europeans, which is basically bottomless, that could in the end save our bacon. But Trump just seems to have like an obsession with Canada. I think that's right. If we could possibly redirect his fury to Europe, then that would be good for us. Then we could go and hide in a cave somewhere.
Vasi Kapelas talked to Francois Philippe Champagne on the Chinese tariffs that they just slapped on us here. We're going to play a clip here from Vasi and Francois here.
Canadian agriculture products in this cultural, pardon me, products in this sense. Over the weekend, China said that it would impose counter tariffs to the EV ones that we put on back in the summer. Is your government thinking about considering removing any tariffs on China?
We're
Any
almost
of those
struggling
EV
with that.
tariffs, for example?
We're not.
You will not.
We're not.
Even given the issues with the United States right now, there's no second guessing our posture towards trade with China at this moment?
Well, I would say not with respect to the tariffs that we put, because there was a good reasons. We would say we would never be a backdoor to cheap Chinese vehicles, which are overly subsidized and where they don't respect labor law and environmental laws. I mean, there's a reasons why they're dumping steel in North America, and you see these cheap vehicles coming here. We want to protect our industry. We want to protect our workers. We want to protect our communities. And the reasons why we imposed the tariff in the first place still remain very valid today, because we want to protect our industry. And the problem.
So no big opening to China at this moment. Like one premier has essentially called for a rethink of that.
I would say, with respect to the tariffs we put, there was a very, very specific reason, and I think people understood that well. And the last thing you would want is my point is, it's a bigger thing. If you look at the forest as opposed to the tree, you said, let's establish rules. If everyone respect the rules, I know we win.
So there you go. We had some technical difficulties there. Hopefully Rommel can fix that for our next clip there. Not sure what's going on there, but you got the audio anyway. There you go. So the Chinese tariffs obviously causing problems for our agricultural industry right now too. We talked about that, I think, in yesterday and the day before show as well. One of the benefits that we might see in all these tariffs is many Canadians aren't just canceling trips to the U.S., they're starting to rebook vacations within Canada. So we may see tourism boost in Canada, which God knows we need some of that here, even in our city here in Kelowna. But also we may see more Americans come this way too. And because, like the lower Canadian dollar and that kind of stuff. So, we might get some benefit in the tourism sector. It'd be a great side benefit to that.
Well, Canadians have loyally spent billions and billions of dollars every year in the US. I mean, it's a little bit it's a bit of a drain really on the entire Canadian economy, isn't it? Like all the snowbirds as well, who just spend an absolute fortune, including like in many cases, their Canadian pensions. They're spending it down there in America. It's like that's a lot of money to lose in the overall transaction between the two countries. So if more of that can be kept in Canada, then that's great news. And yeah, I mean, I think if you were smart about it, you could energize and you could build up a lot of enthusiasm within particularly like the Democrat side of America, like the lefty people. I think you could get them to come up in droves to Canada for a trip. I mean, after all, if you remember during the first Trump presidency, I think it was during the Trump presidency, or not, maybe it was the Biden one, when there was a lot of negative talk about Haiti, and some Americans, including like Conan O'Brien, some like really high profile Americans, like went to Haiti, one of the most dangerous countries on earth, for a vacation, and that was just purely to rub it in the noses of the Republicans. So if they can be encouraged to go to Haiti, I'm sure we can get them up to Canada.
Yeah, so here's a Canadian press story that is on Kelowna Now right now, and how Donald Trump's family fortune began with a BC brothel hotel, and this is up in the Yukon there, probably during the gold rush. Supposedly, the Maple Leaf kind of pushing back against Donald Trump and host a tiny remote restaurant and brothel that helped launch U.S. president's family fortune more than 100 years ago. There you go.
Yeah.
Frederick Trump.
Frederick
Trump called his business in Bennett a town that sprang up because of the Klondike Gold Rush. There you go. The Arctic Restaurant and Hotel. You know, a lot of gold miners making a lot of money, and then I guess the brothel hotel thing was the thing to have back then.
Absolutely. And, you know, you often hear people say that, don't you? Like the smartest people in a gold rush are the ones that sell the shovels or whatever.
Yeah.
And obviously now we know that that was Trump's granddad, Friedrich Trump, up there just trying to exploit the, you know, the naivety and the hopes and dreams of the people looking for gold. And didn't bother with that himself, but just sold food and the company of women.
Looks like if we look at BC politics now, looks like the BC NDP, which is like another expected thing, and the Greens finalized their confidence agreement. So they've signed a 4-year deal. So there you go. They have a 1-seat majority. And it looks like they don't really have much challenges as the BC Conservatives kind of falling apart there, right, with losing three members. The agreement says the
this
parties
is striking
share,
while the iron's hot, isn't it?
Yeah. The agreement says parties share top priorities, including the creation of tens of thousands of affordable non-market housing units, as well as commitment to expand key transit routes to maintain cheap and reliable public transportation. What's missing in there is tapping our vast natural resources, because those two parties not exactly prioritizing that. So,
well, the Green Party will prioritize the opposite. So, I mean, anybody that's hoping for an expansion in natural resources and you know, based wealth in BC will be disappointed, I imagine. And anybody that wants housing to be cheaper will also be disappointed, because regardless of what the Green Party and NDP likes to say, there isn't really any serious evidence that so-called affordable non-market housing brings the price of houses down. Quite the opposite, actually. So,
and hopefully we can
for those people.
And hopefully we can play this clip for you here. This is Kelowna Mission MLA Gavin Dew in question period. Let's see what he has to say there. Rommel?
Kelowna Mission.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Firearm offenses are up threefold in Kelowna. Sexual assaults are up threefold, too. Robberies are up 50%. My constituents in Rutland, in particular, are sick of dealing with drug-induced chaos on their streets. Will the Premier himself stand up and show up and tell the people at the Rutland Residents Association and the Uptown Rutland Business Association why he has thrown their community to the wolves?
So there you go. That story is on KelownaNow.com. You can go read that. Kent Molkat's following that story has reached out to the Kelowna RCMP to get a quote, and I guess they said they're going to refer that to the Lower Mainland RCMP and stuff to get some of that stats here, so we can get a response on that story.
Yeah, I mean, it's a major issue. It's all over Canada, actually, and it's all over British Columbia. But I mean, crime is it's like a blast from the past in many ways, isn't it? It felt like we were in a bit of a safety bubble for a number of years, but now crime is back at the sort of top of most people's lists of concerns.
Yeah, especially in Canada and BC and all that. It's definitely been one of the bigger issues, right? Crime and safety. Danielle Smith put this out on her LinkedIn, and this is actually from the PBO office to the budget office. Estimates that, you know, like Stephen Guilbeault's reduction plans there will cost over 40,000 jobs and reduce GDP by $20 billion. They said that, but Guilbeault is sticking to his gun. Environment Minister Guilbeault told reporters last November that the regulation to be finalized in 2025 would make Canada a world leader. Look around the world, said Guilbeault. No other major oil and gas producer is doing what we're doing. The United States, the United Kingdom, Norway, and the Gulf states were the only large oil and gas producer to do this. Yeah, the reason they don't do it because they don't want to disturb their national wealth.
I mean, he's just simply wrong there on 2 points. The United Kingdom is not a large oil and gas producer anymore. Used to be, but that's about 15 or 20 years out of date, that idea. But also, there, just take it, just treat yourself to 5 or 10 minutes of reading about what the British government has done to its oil industry. It's absolutely ransacked it and destroyed it. It's completely wrecked the oil and gas industry in Britain in just so many ways, including like massive windfall tax, refusing them the right to expand and drill in new, because it's all in the North Sea, refusing their right to drill in any new parts of the sea, completely outright banning fracking, because there's quite a lot of shale gas in Britain as well. I mean, it's the British energy policy is, if you think Canada's energy policy is self-destructive, just have a read of Britain's. So it's funny that Guilbeault would say that. I mean, Britain is arguably, next to the Germans, the world's stupidest country when it comes to energy policy. So have a look at that, Guilbeault.
Well, it looks like Canada wants to join them because that proposed cap would limit oil and gas emissions by 27% below anticipated 2026 levels, but it would cost 40,000 jobs and GDP by 20 billion. And also, like, I mean, if we continue this path that we've been on for 10 years, and we look at where we're at with per capita GDP and the gap that's being built between the United States and Americans, I mean, why would any company invest in Canada if we continue down this same path?
Totally, yeah. But I mean, yeah, I mean, do we want to imitate the British? We've got two like examples, haven't we? We can either imitate the Americans and have the highest GDP per capita in the world, like among actual real countries, rather
Or
than just
Norwegians
tax
for that matter, Norway. Yeah.
Yeah, and although Norway is a country, that's like smaller than Toronto, so
Yeah.
in terms of its population, so it's like it's not obviously it's a real country, but it's not like a big serious power, is it? So if you look at the list, and the Americans are just far and away ahead of everybody in terms of the average wealth of the average person. They also have reasonably low energy prices. They're
Yeah.
taking energy very seriously, and as a consequence, their economy is in many ways the envy of the world, or certainly the Western world. And then you look at the British as the other option. They've destroyed their domestic energy industry. They have the most expensive energy on earth. Their economy is basically hasn't grown in about 20 years. There's a story out today based on a report that came from an economics institute in Britain that has come out and declared that Britain can no longer consider itself a rich country. It's more like Slovenia or Latvia now. I mean, is that what we want? Do you want to live in a country where you're as wealthy as people in Latvia and where you can't turn on the heating for more than like an hour at a time? Is that what you want? Because that's what will happen if we follow the British example.
Well, that's going to be the question in the election that's coming up, right? That's going to be the question. We either have somebody that is pro-energy or somebody that is pro-climate change. So that'll be the question.
Yeah, I mean, the British are like, they're well committed to the net zero and they're very interested in climate change and doing their part and all the rest of it. And yet, have they shifted the dial globally speaking in terms of emissions? Obviously not, no, because Britain, just like Canada in the grand scheme, is a tiny, inconsequential country that couldn't possibly make a difference in terms of emissions.
And the two largest economies, the two largest economies, the United States and China, definitely full steam ahead on energy.
Absolutely. Well, the three sort of
Russia.
biggest emitters, if you include India, you got America first, China first, and India first. They all have nationalist policies. None of them really cares at all about climate change. The Chinese care about it to the extent that they can sell solar panels to gullible Europeans. They're interested in that. The Indians like the idea of being able to blame it all on the West and try and justify their own massive expansion of coal power. And then the Americans obviously don't care about anybody but themselves, and they're just gung ho, shale gas, all the rest of it. Like, it's laughable. It's actually ludicrous, isn't it? That Canada, which couldn't Canada can't make even the tiniest difference to global emissions. It's just pointless. It's just a completely pointless enterprise. And yet Canada's and the British and the Germans, for that matter, they're the ones who are so serious about it. I mean, what a joke.
Well, the one thing that we can credit Justin Trudeau for, I can't remember the year now, but on July 1st, he legalized pot, and it upsprang all these pot dealers. Like them, everybody wanted to have. It was almost like when Alberta privatized liquor stores. Everybody wanted to have a liquor store, and it was usual. So many of them came up that a lot of them didn't do very well, and now there's $42 million in relief being doled out by the Liberal government for pot dealers. So there you go. So if you want, they said that it was the regulation. The cannabis industry is facing economic difficulties, which threaten a key objective of the Cannabis Act, which is to provide legal production of cannabis to displace the illegal cannabis market. But yeah, so they're just saying there's too much regulation. There you go. So what do they want to be? Just maybe they want to, I don't know. This one blows my mind, right? This is Justin Trudeau's, I think, really only claim to fame, because he talks about the dental program and then the childcare, both of which were forced by the NDP. If anyone wants to take credit for that, it would be them.
Well, he did this so early, didn't he, in his term, or in his like tenure as Prime Minister, that maybe people have forgotten about it now. But like, it was. This is internationally anyway. This is like something that he's very strongly associated with. It's like, because Canada was one of the first countries in the world to completely legalize it.
Yeah.
But yeah, funny that now it's just like a regular old sector of the economy, and it's just been treated like as if it's like dairy or something like that.
Yeah, you know what it is? It's an agricultural stock now. And most people, like agriculture gets treated so badly in Canada, and it is one of our greatest industries, but agriculture always getting kind of the bad end of that stick. And right now they're getting the bad end of that stick with the Chinese tariffs as well.
Indeed, yeah. And yet nobody buys. We don't export any of our weed, do we? It's entirely domestic, whereas the agriculture sector at large is, very export heavy.
And yeah, and a famous Brit, and a knighted Brit, actually, Sir Elton John, came out recently and saying one of the biggest mistakes was legalizing pot. And he was definitely a dabbler in many drugs during his career.
Yeah, many vices, I would say, in general. But yeah, I mean, certainly like recent studies, and like certainly since it was legalized in Canada, have sort of associated it very strongly with psychosis and things like that. So, I mean, obviously, they're researching it more and more. And I think you have to be quite a habitual user, but it is, there's a very, very strong link with particularly psychosis, but also other sort of mental problems.
A lot of these weed stocks initially were old resource stocks that, they couldn't get any money for resources. So as soon as this pot thing came out, they basically do reverse takeovers and become like weed stocks, and a lot of them shot to the moon. And just like everything, I mean, I remember being a part of it, and I knew like July 1st would be the end of it, right? As soon as it became legal, that the part of that, the attraction of that sector would just die. And of course it did. It just plummeted off a cliff right at July 1st there, right? You can just go take a look at all the weed stocks, and after July 1st, and you can just see them going into kind of like a nuclear winter after that.
Well, it was predicated on a complete fantasy, wasn't it? Which was that it would, all along, it was predicated on a fantasy, which was that it would kill the black market. We wouldn't have a black market anymore. But I mean, the black market's still there, still as strong as ever, like it was never going to kill that, was it?
I mean, I did buy some weed stocks back then, and they did very well, but I sold July 1st. I knew that would be the end of it, right? Just like any of these things, these bubbles that kind of come up, and there's one of our commenters saying that his pot stocks are in the toilet. Yeah, I mean, that's typically what happens when you see these things, the bubble, and then pop, and then they go into kind of like a nuclear winter for a long, long time, and it's like, it's a tough slug, right?
Definitely.
There you go. And NDP, speaking of the NDP, NDP put out an ad on Mark Carney, and it's got over 1 million views on YouTube. Look at that. The NDP created. We're going to run this ad for you here. We'll give the NDP some more love for their ad here.
Liberal leader Mark Carney has quite the resume. But let's take a closer look. He was vice chair at Brookfield when they evicted tenants and raised rents to boost corporate landlord profits. And he was caught lying about Brookfield's environmental record to make more money for investors. For Carney, making the rich richer is just another day at the office. That's a big red flag. Mark Carney, in it for billionaires, not for working people.
I'd say the one thing that Mark Carney needs to do is disclose, and he's been very elusive on that, and it's very tough to trust someone, especially he's been caught in a few lies as well on his moving of Brookfield Asset Management headquarters to the United States, and they tried to backpedal, and then like the Liberal Party trying to say, oh, he did it after. I mean, then they trying to pick up different. Oh, the ratification date was after. I mean, it's just not being honest. That's all.
Well, I think the NDP, they've sort of gone back to basics here, haven't they? They used to try this sort of thing on with Trudeau, where they say like Trudeau was a friend of the billionaire, but I'm not sure it really stuck with Trudeau because, I mean, you might have been able to argue that along like abstract terms, but that wasn't really Trudeau's bag, was it? Whereas Mark Carney is almost like a caricature of like a banker, like a very well-heeled international banker who's worked for Goldman Sachs and all the rest of it, Brookfield, and just dabbled here and there, gone to Britain and the US, and I think he was in Japan, wasn't he, for quite a while? So it's kind of like he's the perfect target for this. And my feeling is that as time wears on and Canadians start to get used to this man being their leader, this is going to increasingly hurt them. I think this kind of attack, especially when something happens, as it always does for a leader, something happens that requires an emotional response, which is something that love him or hate him, Justin Trudeau was at home with that kind of thing, where he could go and like hug people and get the tears out, and like say something to make people feel comfortable or whatever. Usually he would be mocked for it, but he could still do it. It was like that was his strong point. I feel like if something like that happens where it requires an emotional response, I don't think Carney really has that up his sleeve, to be honest. He's very sort of dull, really, isn't he? He's very sort of like boring. I mean, Carney's supporters would say it in a good way. He's like good kind of boring, but that might harm him, I think, when he has to sort of generate an emotional response to something.
The National Post out with an opinion piece on Mark Carney there, saying that the Brits warn that Canada's new Prime Minister has a reverse Midas touch. And you and I have talked about that quite a bit, though, because he was actually their Bank of England governor there, and he was actually trying to encourage them to stay in the EU.
Yeah, I mean, he would say that that's not true. He would say that he's like, I never did any such thing, my lord. But obviously, central bankers, they know how to say things in a certain way, and he certainly did say lots of things that it was pretty unambiguous, really. In central banker world, he was not neutral on that subject, and he warned about terrible recessions and economic catastrophes and all sorts of things that just never came to pass. It was just complete nonsense, really. And as a consequence, particularly among the pro-Brexit people in Britain, he was deemed to be sort of unforgivably political, and they were quite happy when he left, I think. And that's a lot of the Conservative Party in Britain. But I think even the Labour Party, like the left-wing party, they didn't really like him either because of his fondness for quantitative easing, aka money printing. And they thought that he'd, as we've said many times, that he'd inflated the price of assets to the benefit of the wealthy, and basically introduced inflation for the little man.
Well, we've seen that during the COVID and the economic policies here in Canada, that the disparity in wealth has gotten bigger and bigger, and a lot of people got really rich during COVID, especially people that owned assets. Like the inflation, actually very much a friend to the rich, and the ones that own a lot of assets, and very much an enemy to the masses of people. And that's what easy money policies do. It really helps inflate asset bubbles.
Yeah, but I mean, that's maybe what we're talking about here is somewhat abstract, and a lot of people might be kind of rolling their eyes. I know they don't want to hear it, but I would say a way to sort of summarize Mark Carney's time as central banker in Britain is the British economy during his tenure did not improve. In fact, it got worse. So, if his job there as the governor of the Bank of England was to promote growth and keep inflation steady, those are like his jobs basically. He didn't really do a very good job, frankly. So I have a sense that, when they start to debate, Poilievre and Carney, when they begin to actually debate and get into the real sort of nitty-gritty of it, I feel like Carney is not really going to want to talk about his time in Britain. He's going to just want to talk about the financial crash when he was Bank of Canada governor.
Yeah, and then here's a post by a Liberal MP, Jonathan Wilkinson, saying, does Pierre Poilievre really think he's more qualified than an Oxford PhD, an economics grad, an executive director at Goldman Sachs, and the former governor of 2 central banks? So they're really throwing out that credentials for, it's the next slide there. You were going to put that slide up. You had it there, Rommel. It's that one? No. It's that one you did not. Rommel signaling doesn't have it. Anyway, credentials. So you were going to say something about that.
Well, what Jonathan Wilkinson is guilty of here is something called credentialism, which is the idea that simply because you have the credentials, like, you're the boy, get in the car, like, you'll fix things. But as anybody who has succeeded in aging past about 21 or something like that knows, credentials don't equal competence. I mean, that's been true for all time. But especially in this era, where we've seen people with immaculate credentials, just like Mark Carney's, make catastrophic, unbelievable mistakes across the Western world. Economic mistakes, military mistakes, political mistakes, everything. We've seen people who quite literally could not have better resumes. We've seen them do things that so stupid that, it's absolutely true in my mind that a random person dragged off the street would never have made decisions as stupid as that. I mean, just off the top of my head, I'm thinking of like Ursula von der Leyen, like an aristocratic German member of the elite who's now in charge of the EU. She's now the commissioner of the European Union. Like, her credentials, as you'd expect, all bloody magical credentials. And she was the defense minister of Germany. That was her, before she became commissioner of the EU, that was like the high point of her career.
I'll put it up on.
And while she was the commissioner, while she was the defense minister in Germany, the German military was pure garbage, is still garbage, and it was so garbage that German soldiers were forced to carry broomsticks instead of rifles because they didn't have even the most basic equipment. So it's like somebody like Ursula von der Leyen, who is manifestly a fool and completely incompetent, rather goes against this argument being made by Jonathan Wilkinson, I would humbly submit.
Yeah, we were going to put that tweet up, but it's Jonathan's tweet, but it has some bad words in there too. I've worked in both worlds. I come from a very poor background, and I've worked on the oil rigs. I've worked in sawmills. I've worked as a cook in a kitchen, a dishwasher, and construction jobs, all kinds of jobs, and also an accountant. And I've worked in Toronto on Queen Street in some of the biggest towers with some of the biggest people, like some of the people. And I would tell you, the people that are the salt of the earth, they're definitely easiest to talk to all the time. And sometimes arrogance gets in the way, and they don't see what everybody else sees. The majority of Canadians are salt of the earth, and like, if you're an elitist, it's tough to see the problems. Like, we can remember when Chrystia Freeland, when people were saying that they were struggling, and she said, "Well, it's just a vibe. You don't understand that you have it so good, and maybe you should maybe just cut your Disney account." And but they don't see that the struggles of the common man. And I think it's these people are out of touch sometimes, and they don't actually haven't walked. You remember the old stories where the king would walk amongst the people to understand what was really going on? I don't think a lot of these elitists ever actually take a walk out there, because It was also shown in that one debate he did in the Leader. He didn't even know what the cost of groceries were. Remember in the Liberal leadership debate?
Yeah. Well, he's been pretty sort of comfortable, hasn't he, ever since he left Edmonton? He's had a pretty sort of cozy life. But I would say, like, you're right what you say, but also to be a little bit more sort of specific, I would say these people, the ones who have, who are praised for their resumes, they often seem to be highly susceptible to ideology. And that is obviously, when I was having a go at Ursula von der Leyen just then, I mean, obviously she's not a stupid person, is she? But she's doing very, very stupid things because she's been captured by an ideology, by the kind of soggy hyper-liberalism that's predominated in Europe since the end of the Cold War. And she's not really capable of challenging that because, in a way, she's like suffering because of the class that she's in, because she's surrounded by people who believe in this ideology almost as if it's a religion. Whereas I think people that come up from the ground and have, common sense, if you want to call it that, they're a bit more resistant to these preposterous abstract ideas. And we've seen this again and again and again with Trump, with things like, the reaction to COVID-19 and the debate about transgenderism and all sorts of things. We've seen again and again and again that the elite, like the most credentialed people, are often saying the most unfathomably stupid things because they're susceptible to this crazy ideology. But the last thing that I would say though about this is, don't focus on credentials. I'd say this to Mr. Wilkinson here, Johnny Wilkinson. I would say don't focus on credentials, focus on results. Results are what matter. And you can have all the credentials in the world, up to and including a mighty Oxford PhD, and you can still have failed in your life. And, that's what we should concentrate on, not what university somebody went to.
Well, we've had 10 years of an elitist running this country, and that didn't. And if we look at the wealth gap, the rich have done very well in this, and many of the politicians have done very well in the last 10 years. The majority of Canadians have not done well. And, that is the question you have to ask yourself. Do you want more of the same? Then put another elitist in charge. And
Yeah.
And the self-proclaimed elitist as well. He called, and I'm not making this stuff up. He said himself in one of his interviews, he is a global elitist, and he identified as a European. And then this next story here, here's where it starts. CTV put out this headline and says, "Can Canada join the EU? Flattered Brussels hails the strong ties." And so, I mean, I know this is probably a far-fetched thing, but that would probably be one of the worst things for Canada. But if Mark Carney identifies as a European, would he try to get Canada to be part of the EU? And we talk about all the problems that the EU has. Do we want those parked on our doorstep, or do we want to have prosperity for Canadians?
Yeah, well, that's another one. That's another one where it's like, on the one hand, you've got ideology, and on the other hand, you've got reality. In ideological terms, for true believers, the EU is like a magnificent success. It's this, it's this like oasis of sensibleness and progressive values and all sorts of things. That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is purely in sort of like real terms. Just look at the reality. Look at how they failed with immigration policy, lowering living standards, energy policy, defense policy. I mean, it's a clown show. And all you have to do is look at the actual results. Look at the reality of the European Union. It's a mess. Whereas, but to a lot of people in the US and Canada and obviously in Europe, the EU is this kind of like magnificent achievement, and it's like its liberal values, sort of in this glorious institution. It's it's not how I like to do things anyway. I try to eschew ideology myself and just look at the results. But whether or not we can persuade everybody in the world to do that, that's a question, isn't it?
Do you remember when we weren't allowed to talk about this? Now the German spy agency says, yeah, COVID came from a lab leak. And, Donald Trump said it, and he was, crucified for it, as well as, many people were pulled off of YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, all those things for daring saying this. And here it goes. And I think the Americans have confirmed this as well. And when did we know? Because I mean, they share this information. When did we know, and why weren't we allowed to talk about it at the time?
Yeah, well, they compiled this report in 2020, which is the exact period when you could have your life destroyed, basically, and you were being called a conspiracy theorist by none other than highly credentialed individuals. These people with these glorious credentials who
Right.
stood up behind podiums and said, that's a conspiracy theory, don't be stupid. While simultaneously, reality was, trotting along by the side in the shadows. It's just yet another example of how the leadership class in the West has just failed again and again and again. And this
During,
is an example not just of failure, but of failing and then hiding that and attacking people that try to expose your failure, which is probably the worst kind of failure that you can be guilty of.
I'd like to take a famous Ronald Reagan quote and modify it. His was one of his quotes was, when you hear we're from the government and we're here to help, he said, run. The one that I would like to modify that is this: I'm an expert, and this is what you should do. I think that's where you should plug your ears.
Yeah, I mean, I can laugh and I get that joke, but it's also very sad, isn't it? I mean, it didn't used to be like this, and it didn't have to be like this either, did it? Like, it seems like the trust that Western citizens had in their institutions was recklessly thrown away, and I think now we can rue that and be sad about that because it was a very precious asset and it was something that was really important to the stability of our societies here in the West. But I just wonder, like, how many years, how many decades is it going to take to win back that trust? And it's every institution, politics, police, medicine now since COVID. It's an uphill battle. But I really, I would really hope that we can resurrect that feeling of trust.
Yeah, no, it's that expert thing was overused and over kind of like, and then the people that had a difference of opinion villainized, and even Canadian doctors here and U.S. doctors that were losing their licenses and banned and all kinds of things. I mean, things were that it was definitely not, and especially for them and the media as well. I mean, we did some stories that because we're trying to be pluralists. We did some stories that we were threatened with a bunch of things too. So.
Yeah, the media just failed. I mean, just to talk about Canada, the media failed. That's another institution, obviously, that nobody trusts anymore. They failed catastrophically, didn't they, during COVID? And I can just remember the BC press conferences with Bonnie Henry and the servile questions being asked, totally incurious, servile questions from members of the media who still have their jobs now. They've been promoted, they're like they're happy as Larry. And yet the biggest crisis that they've ever covered in their careers, they completely failed. They just sat there, and in many cases, they sat there and they asked questions to try and get people in trouble who were asking questions. So there were people who were out, like doctors, like you say, who were maybe raising the alarm a bit and saying, I'm not so sure about this. And then there were journalists in Victoria asking Bonnie Henry if she's aware of this. And Adrian Dix, like, did you know that this doctor's doing this? Like, what are you going to do about this? It's just like, oh yeah, good for you. Good for you, man.
And we were allowed to attend these press conferences, but never allowed to ask a question. It was always the same questions from the same people. And we did questions, we did stories on the trucker rally as well. And we got so much flack for doing that, even from the general public, because I think, like the government kind of like deputized so many people to go after this screaming mob, right? That went after people and made all these accusations that these truckers were getting money from Russia, cut off bank accounts. The thing just kind of like just exploded into this fear campaign.
Yeah, a large proportion of the population was radicalized, and usually when people say that, what they're meaning is people that became hostile to vaccinations and so on. That's not the kind of radicalization I mean. I mean, they became pro-authoritarian. They were radicalized in a completely different way, and they started to hunt down heresy. They started to hunt down the oddballs, didn't they? The people that refused to go along with the COVID lockdown restrictions and so on. I mean, there's no other word for it. There's no other term for it. They were radicalized, as was much of the elite.
Yeah. Well, we aired interviews with doctors that were, like fired, nurses that were fired and stuff like that. And we took a lot of heat for that too, by telling the other side of the story.
Yep, indeed.
And then you put this one up in the 5 things to know today. The scumbag of the day. There you go. There's somebody that decided that they wanted to snag a baby wombat away from the mother, and as a joke. You know, like these
Yeah, well, to get hits, I guess.
yeah, these internet people sometimes get carried away, right? With like, how you can do something stupider than the next person. You know, you see some of the stuff, and some of these guys have done extremely well. Like Mr. Beast on YouTube. I mean, he's like one of the biggest accounts going. Now he's giving away like sums of like, I don't know, $5 or $10 million for getting people to do stupid things. So obviously, there's incentive to be as stupid as you can be.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in the grand scheme, this is probably on the tamer side. It's still horrible to see. It's a horrible video because the little wombat mother is like panicking and like, "Where's my baby?" As you might expect, it's a really horrible thing to do to animals. But it's tamer than some, like in Britain, for example. There's a violent hooligan that records videos of himself like breaking into people's houses and things like that and frightening just random pedestrians and doing all sorts of like really truly scummy, horrible things, criminal things. And he's become like a celebrity in Britain. So I mean, it could still be worse.
Yeah. We do a weekly show with former MLA of Kelowna Mission, Renee Merrifield, Beyond the Ballot. And I think this is one of her better shows. You go on KelownaNow.com and you can watch it. She says quite a few things in regards to the BC Conservative Party, including the NDP and a whole bunch of things. We talked about quite a few things in that episode. It's a great episode to go listen to.
It is good, yeah. Lots of comments about Trump, BC Conservatives, David Eby, economics. She covers it all.
She was on fire, let's just say that.
I think she was in a very passionate mood. She was really had some scores to settle, I think.
Yeah, she was on fire. There you go. Let's move on to markets. Gold looking like it wants to challenge that $3,000 mark. I mean, that's going to be a tough hurdle, that $3,000 mark. It's a psychological thing, but it looks like it wants to bang on the door there, right? It looks like it wants to knock on the door. So we've been talking about that for a while. A nice slow creep up there, right? Bitcoin's starting to churn in that $8,000 mark there as it tries to fill that gap that when November 5th, when Trump was elected, it gapped up, and now it looks like it's trying to fill that gap here before it moves higher. Canadian dollar, again, looking for direction. As we anticipate Mark Carney to be sworn in on Friday as Canada's Prime Minister. And then we're also anticipating that an election is called, and we're seeing a lot of noise from a lot of different places that the election is going to be called forthwith, and I think that'll be a relief for Canadians. And then we can get in serious, and then Canadians can decide. And I think that's, even if Mark Carney wins, I think he needs, or whoever wins, they need a clear mandate from Canadian people as to what goes on here. And I think they need to listen to the Canadian people.
Yeah, I think there's been a democratic deficit, as they like to call it in policy, in the policy world. There's been a real deficit in that we've been governed by a prime minister whose party did not win the most votes in the last 2 elections. He has led Canada since 2015, and yet the last time that he won the most votes in an election was 2015. So
And it's like,
his party has done that. So, and they've done it with the assistance of the NDP, a relatively sort of minor party, and it hasn't really felt all that democratic, has it? Even though it's obviously within the constitutional, what's permitted by the constitution. But I mean, it still doesn't feel all that great, does it, in terms of democracy?
I think this, like, it kind of like it's an unusual occurrence because you had 2 people, not very popular, Jagmeet Singh and Justin Trudeau, but they supported each other, and they definitely lacked empathy for Canadians, but they continued to kind of feed off each other, and it seemed to be about them always, just about them personally, and it'll be interesting to see where Jagmeet Singh plays out in this election as well. It doesn't look good for him right now.
Yeah, well, I think the NDP has an interesting dilemma in front of it, really, doesn't it? It has to differentiate itself from the Liberals. It's going to have to spend a lot of time attacking Carney, and attacking the liberals to try and just say like, look, left-wing people or liberal people vote for us because for this reason. But then simultaneously, they're going to have to get stuck into the Tories, which is that what they prefer to do. So it is a hard one, and obviously they've got to attack the liberals while reality sits there in a not very sort of reassuring way for the NDP, in that they've spent the last several years propping up Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party. So everything that they complain about was done thanks to them.
Yeah. Yep. In our AI tech segment, OpenAI releases new tools for building AI agents. So this is starting to look like this stuff is going to start actually working, where it's actually going to go out and browsing and a whole bunch of different things. It's going to, start doing work for you, like booking appointments, all kinds of stuff. So, and then you and I talked a little bit yesterday. OpenAI launched 4.5, and it's done really well in like creative writing and that too, right? So there you go.
Yeah.
We just make up stories. I mean, we know a lot of experts have made up stories, so there you go. We can actually join them, right?
Maybe we can make up credentials and then we can justify our failures.
There you go. Drones, robots, and then that's China's next thing. No, not that. I just yeah. So the Mobile World Conference in Barcelona, AI took center stage with Chinese companies showcasing innovative applications. Yeah, lots of stuff, robotics coming, tons and tons and tons of stuff. So it's going to be an interesting next little while as robotics start to take off. Tesla, one of the leaders in that realm as well. So I don't know those people that are freaking out on Tesla right now. What are they going to do when they can't buy an Optimus robot right now? They're burning down Teslas and stuff like that. But what happens when the robot army goes out there? What are they going to do?
They're going to have to do their own laundry when everybody else is sitting back, chilling out, and letting the robot do it.
With this, along with this hate for Tesla, here you go. BC excludes Tesla from clean BC rebates, despite allowing other U.S. brands. There you go. Politics playing a role in supposedly the best EV manufacturer out there by far being shut out because of politics. Yeah, there you go. And here you go. Corporate welfare, all good though. If you look in Quebec there with Francois Philippe Champagne again, that corporate welfare, they doled out over $4.3 billion in federal subsidies and $2.9 billion in aid from the government of Quebec to build a battery plant with Northvolt, which is now filed for bankruptcy. Instead of like funding real things, or even like don't even have to fund like some stuff for Tesla, getting the real, the world leader in battery technology, and that. All this corporate welfare is doled out to these companies. We've seen it here in British Columbia. We've seen it in Quebec, in Ontario, and all this stuff. And they end up being nothing but utter failures. And we have a similar situation going on here in British Columbia. This is basically
when will they ever learn?
Corporate
when will
welfare,
they learn?
right?
I mean,
and what they like to do is shag on. They use an English word. They're shag on Elon Musk and Tesla, a real company that's making profits. Well, they go and dole out corporate welfare to these failed companies, and like, where's the money go? Like, what happens to this? The other one that just got a ton of money that was highlighted by, we've done interviews with Chase Barber here. He applied for a grant with the BC government and was refused it, and they gave that money to a company here in Kelowna, like $10 million. And we did the story on it, and they just left. So there you go. I mean, they laid off a bunch of employees. So this corporate welfare, it's the same thing I think they did with Honda, to build an EV plant in Ontario, which is likely never going to happen, right?
yeah, it's this happens a lot in Europe as well, and this particular company, Northvolt, they were subsidized all over the place, and then they've just completely failed. It's like,
yeah.
It's just,
one of the.
You'd think they would be embarrassed, wouldn't you? But somehow I don't think that Francois Philippe Champagne is embarrassed.
Yeah, he goes up on the podium all the time, and he just talks nonsense, this guy, right? So, but, again, the government was prorogued for another reason, too, is because they wouldn't release the documents on the $200+ million that was doled out for more corporate welfare.
Yeah, but have you seen his credentials? Pretty good credentials there for Champagne. Pretty pretty highly regarded lawyer. I think he was somehow involved in the WEF as well and praised by the World Economic Forum. So
Hmm.
credentials like you wouldn't believe.
That's
Results,
what.
however, not so much.
Yeah, and that's something we were just talking about Edison. That's Chase Barber of Edison Motors, right? Stealing Tesla's ideas is his slogan. Yeah, we've interviewed him a few times. Got some videos on him here. Great guy. And then Trump actually, the EPA rolling back Biden's EV mandate. So that's going to have a lot of effect on the Canadian automakers as well. If Canada doesn't roll back those EV mandates to match what the Americans are doing, you'll likely see the automakers and the legacy automakers in Canada leave. They'll close the factories likely, not because of
Well,
tariffs.
it's push and pull, isn't it, in that situation?
And then, the last Canadian automaker of any significance was Bricklin. Remember the Bricklins? I think they made them for 2 years out there in Newfoundland of Back to the Future fame. Made out of, I think Elon Musk might have stole some of those ideas because that was made out of stainless steel as well.
I think that's probably right. Yeah, it was very much like a sci-fi car, and it actually does look a lot like the Cyber Cab, doesn't it?
Elon takes a lot of ideas from other places, like, even his whole model, his model numbers, right? It comes from the old Henry Ford Model T, right? Henry Ford,
Indeed.
when he launched his Assembly line, he said you could have any color you want as long as it's black, right? And even Elon Musk is very limited in his color choices, right? So there you go. Weather, a big thing. Like you look outside, like we haven't seen snow here in Kelowna for a while, and we got a lot of highways closed right now. I think we got Highway 1 closed in both directions near Salmon Arm, and that is likely not to open till about 3 o'clock today. So if you're heading east of Kelowna, be aware that you may have to go around or maybe you have to wait a bit here. The weather's supposed to improve though. But yeah. And then in our memes, we got some memes here for you. Always never to disappoint with the memes here. And this is the one where they say this COP26 thing, or COP25, what is it? COP25, I think it's going to take place in the Amazon rainforest. So they're clearing their Amazon rainforest so they can get a highway there for the big meeting.
Yeah, so that they can drive their convoys of limousines and SUVs right up there to talk about how you shouldn't drive an SUV.
One of the things that Trudeau introduced for Canada, because we never used to have that, Jean Chrétien at least, it was one of my political heroes, did his own security. Remember, he would actually grab the guy with the Shawinigan, he called it a Shawinigan, I can't remember what he called it, Shawinigan handshake, right? He grabbed the guy by the face, right? And never had the motorcades like Justin Trudeau. Justin Trudeau, I mean, I think he's going to miss that, his 20-plus motorcade telling everybody that they got to not drive. Like I think Chrystia Freeland says she doesn't know why people even need a car. And yet Justin Trudeau, his motorcades were like 20-plus of these big, huge black SUVs, right?
I mean, she makes a good point though, Christy, doesn't she? Like, why would you need your own car? Just call up your chauffeur. Yeah. And then you'll get wherever you need to go. I mean, it's pretty simple, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, she said that most Canadians shouldn't even have a car because she rides her bike to work. And she failed to mention that, like you said, she has a chauffeur-driven limousine that's provided by the government. She has a salary of $350,000, lives in a posh apartment there in Ottawa, and has everything basically paid for. And yet she doesn't understand how the person in, at least the multitude of small towns in everywhere across Canada where you have to drive, like take, small towns like even Enderby where you have to drive to a hospital. And there's no chauffeur.
Towns where you can't even rely on a bus. Like there's no alternatives there.
No chauffeur to pick you up. High Level, Alberta. We could go on and on. Dawson Creek, Fort St. John, Williams Lake, like lots and lots of Canadians live in different places, not in huge metropolitan centers. But you know who's making the decisions for most of Canada? The people living in metropolitan centers. And they dole that advice out. They listen to the advice of these highly credentialed experts. There you go. And we got one more meme there for you. And this is a good one. I'll let you do this one here.
Well, this is, they're getting rid of, I think they actually want to abolish the Department of Education entirely, don't they, in the US?
They do.
But yeah, do they actually know how to calculate 50%? I would suspect that there'd be quite a large number of them that would fail that.
They want to put education back at the state level, and they say, why do we have like duplication of efforts, really, right? So, and I think
That's what it used to be like, isn't it, back in the day?
yeah. So, I mean, the numbers in the U.S. are pretty bad for education. Their stats are pretty abysmal, and that's what this joke makes fun of. Is that even the Department of Education can't figure out how many people are getting fired.
Yeah, I mean, America, they're the best and the worst of everything, aren't they? They also have the best universities, the best students in many ways, and then they also have some of the worst.
Yeah, yeah, it's an interesting time for sure. Hopefully, Canada needs some certainty for sure for Canadians to invest and to attract other investment. And but again, the big thing that people should know, and hopefully, if Mark Carney becomes PM here tomorrow, he will recall Parliament, because it's 66 days that Parliament has been operating. Yet they've been making deals like crazy. I don't even know how they're doing all these deals, right? Like $4 billion to just to plan high-speed rail between Quebec and Ontario, Quebec City and Toronto. Hey, how are they doing that?
Indeed.
Indeed. There you go. That's our show for today. We're back tomorrow for the last show of the week, and then we're 5 days a week here on Kelowna Now around 9 o'clock. And you can follow us on X, YouTube, TikTok, and then, of course, on KelownaNow.com. We put this story up on KelownaNow.com and embed the video at that time, too. We appreciate your feedback and your thoughts always. And, yeah. And then one of the viewers there said he's worked in high level. I lived in high level for 8 years. And I think everybody should live in high level for a while or anywhere. I've also worked in Thompson, Manitoba. Again, I've worked in office towers downtown Toronto, and I've worked out in the mines and the mills and the drills, and mines, mills, and drills, and northern Canada. Canada is a beautiful country. There is nothing like it, and we definitely need to start prioritizing the assets of Canada to make Canadians rich, not just the elites rich. How's that?
What an idea.
What an idea. I know it's a tough thing, right, to just make a small segment of the population rich, but what if we just focus on making everybody rich? Because when I was working at the mines and the mills and on the drills, those jobs there build families. People buy pickup trucks and they buy homes with those salaries, right? And we've been, in the last little while, been embarrassed of those jobs and tried to kind of say that we don't need them. The other thing is that if you walk through any hospital, you're going to see most of the donations come from companies like Kinross, Barrick, large oil companies, and everything. So it's about time we have some respect. And if you go look at the TSX, last thing, if you go look at the TSX and look at the companies listed on the TSX, they have to do with Canadian resources. It's time to respect where we came from and where we're going as well. With that said, we do thank you for watching Kelowna Now.
We don't just report the news. We live here too. We're your neighbors, bringing you stories that matter to all of us. No government funding, no outside influence. Kelowna Now.